And here we are coming to you from the Radio Theater upstairs at the Chapel FM Arts Center. We are in the final stretch of our 7-day, 76 event Writing on Air Festival here at Chapel FM Arts Center, all on the theme of missing. It's been a busy morning, lots of events, some experimental projects, including the Missing Music program, which was a great success. We played silent films on the screen here and had musicians improvising along, creating all kinds of wild, wonderful, cacophonous music, along with Charlie Chaplin and other sorts of films as well. This evening, we've got a number of events coming up in the next few hours or so. We're going to have the results of a workshop up here in about an hour and a half, a program called The Silence of Aloneness. And then we have a resident ensemble, Through Our Eyes, which is an ensemble that ensures that musicians with any abilities, with disabilities, have a place to make all kinds of adventurous music, and they're fantastic. They're going to be presenting some world premiere pieces up here at 6 o'clock, and then we end the festival at 6:30 with a live version of The Deli. But it's been a busy last 2 weeks. Yesterday we had the Red Kite Live, the youth broadcasters in. Friday we had a really exciting, important program about the legacy of David Alawale, and the new memorial to him, Hibiscus Rising. But now, in a bit, we're going to have a conversation about another really important figure from Leeds culture, a poet and also a filmmaker, Tony Harrison. And then we're going to be projecting one of his films up here in the Radio Theater. So for listeners out in Radio Land, we'll be having music. Is that right, Elliot, when the film's projecting? But this next bit, for about 20 minutes, we're going to have a conversation about Tony Harrison's work. So if anyone listening out there, if you know Tony Harrison, there's going to be some really interesting insights into his work, particularly some of his film work. And if you don't know Tony Harrison, all the better, because you'll find out about someone who I think, and we think around here at Chapel FM, is one of the really significant people in Leeds over the last century, as a poet, as a political spokesperson, as an activist, and as a filmmaker, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So, to get ready to introduce the film and talk about Tony Harrison, I'm going to invite onto the mic here Richard Bergen, who is MP for East Leeds. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Tony. How are you doing?
Good. It's thanks for joining us again.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, and this has been a particular project. This is the second time we've talked about and shown one of Tony Harrison's films here, and his film work, which is, I'm holding up a book here called The Collected Film Poetry, and his films are sort of seen as, the genre is film poetry, which itself is a really fascinating thing, a way of thinking about cinema in some very different ways, from the perspective, basically, of a poet, bringing a poet's sensibility to filmmaking. But your connection with Tony Harrison's work, and just a little bit of background on him, when did you first encounter Tony Harrison?
I first came across Tony Harrison in my first week at university. Now, I was the first person from my family to go to university, and I was lucky enough to study English literature down at Cambridge. And of course, I was a bit apprehensive about what this was going to be like. But in the first week, my tutor, Con Coronius from Australia, he introduced us to Tony Harrison's work. And it was in the very first week of our English literature course down at Cambridge University. And I remember thinking, wow, this makes me feel really welcome as a state school educated person, first person from a family to go to university down at Cambridge. I was apprehensive, but learning about Tony Harrison and being introduced to Tony Harrison's poetry in my first week there made me feel at home. He was from Leeds, he had a similar political outlook to me. He was speaking the language to echo Tony Harrison that we spoke at home. But what I also remember is that some of the other students didn't like him. When I met Tony, I told him that, and he thought that was very funny, that some of the students loved him and some of them didn't. And I think the kind of students that liked being introduced to his work were the kind of people who liked the whole sentiment, the radical sentiment of his work, speaking for and speaking as somebody from the working class in Leeds. And some of the students that didn't like it thought it was a bit edgy. But I thought when you're a student, you should be liking things that are edgy, but some of them didn't, I'm afraid. But that in itself provoked interesting conversations about Tony and his work.
Well, to me, that's such a powerful image, this idea of coming from Leeds, going down to Cambridge to study literature, all the complexities with that, class, north-south divide, and then encountering Tony Harrison's work there, and that, of course, opening up this rift amongst some of the students, some who really connected with it, some who didn't. For someone out there who has no idea who Tony Harrison is, just let's maybe start with some of the basics. And between us, maybe we can just give people a sketch of Tony Harrison and why he's worth exploring.
Well, Tony was born in Leeds in Beeston in 1937, and he was the son of a baker from a very working class background, and he got a scholarship to Leeds Grammar School, a private school now, but he got a scholarship there when he passed his 11 plus, and he went there, and that kind of set in motion the kind of conflict, I think, that's worked through Tony Harrison's life and his work, in that there's this tension between his background and between where he ended up, and his desire to be still where he's from and speak for that, but being pulled in other directions. And he explains this in a great poem he writes about being at Leeds Grammar School as a scholarship boy called Them and Us. And he remembers being belittled by his English teacher at Leeds Grammar School, who gave him the role of the drunken porter in Shakespeare's play Macbeth, the least important character, supposedly, or one of the least important characters, because he goes that we don't pronounce poetry like this, we don't pronounce words like that. And in Them and Us, Tony Harrison's idea of reclaiming poetry for the majority, reclaiming poetry for the working class, came out. And then he had an incredible career. He studied classics at Leeds University. His first book of poetry was called Loiners, which of course is what they call people from Leeds. It was all about people from Leeds, but also about his travels around the world as well, as a young man. And then he became one of the pioneers of film poetry, and that's why it's great we're seeing this film poem today, marrying the different camera shots in film, and being a director of it himself, with his poetry. And he's perhaps most famous for his famous poem V, which became a film poem, poem that came out in 1987 on Channel 4, which some MPs tried to ban. They said it had too many swear words and it was too radical. It was written in 1984 during the miners' strike. It was set in Beeston Cemetery, which overlooks Leeds United's ground, and it talks about class conflict in society, and it's an incredible, very readable poem. And each time I go back to that, I get something more out of it. He did so many fantastic film poems. He translated classics into English and was very successful with that. But everything he's done, whether it's translation, whether it's theatre, whether it's poetry, Tony Harrison's always been clear that it is poetry, and he sees himself as a poet. And the film poems are an innovative way of pushing his poetry in a different way. He was famous as well for his anti-war poems in relation to the first Iraq War, for example, and the subsequent Iraq War. And he used to write poetry which was printed as op-eds in The Guardian, for example. And he'd write them very quickly about, almost like as a war correspondent. Quite incredible to use poetry almost as a form of reporting. And I think one of the interesting things, and I'll finish on this because if somebody asked me to talk about Tony Harrison, I can waffle on for ages, but one of the most noticeable things about Tony's work, in my opinion, is the way he marries traditional forms of poetic structure in terms of rhyme schemes and the rhythms of poetry with the radical politics and poetry for and about the working class. And that's quite unusual in that he takes traditional forms and uses them for a radical purpose. You can see that both in the way because lots of poetry these days, of course, doesn't have a scheme. It's kind of free form. Tony Harrison's poetry generally isn't. But you can also see the way he marries traditional with radical in the way that he has repurposed the classics for modern radical purposes, the Greek tragedies, for example. But actually, through doing that, he has kind of reclaimed or re-aired the radical purpose of those classic. For example, his film poem Prometheus, about Aeschylus's hero Prometheus, who was seen really as a prototype socialist, a god that was tortured by Zeus for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humanity, therefore blurring the division or the demarcation between the god class and the class of humanity. In that way, it was seen as a prototype socialist. So that's some thoughts on Tony Harris. And I think it's really important that we embrace him here in Leeds, of course. He's recognised around the world. He's won the European Prize for Literature, and he's recognised around the world. His plays have been staged in Greece, in the United States, in Russia, all around the world. He really is internationally renowned and recognised as one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. But I think it's also important that we embrace him in Leeds. I was really glad to see a few years ago he was given the Leeds Award, and his name is on the stone wall inside at Leeds Civic Hall, because we should be proud of the fact that one of the greatest poets in the world from the 20th century, and I'd argue one of the greatest poets ever, actually came from Leeds, from a working class background, has never forgotten where he's come from, and has always written for that purpose. I think that's something we should be very proud of as a city and as a community, which is why I'm really pleased that Chapel FM is screening some of his film poems.
And that Leeds connection, as you say, despite the fact that he's ranged across so many topics, Greek tragedies, he's adapted the mystery plays, the medieval mystery plays as well for contemporary language. But the connection to Leeds comes back again in so many ways. And there's so many interesting poems. I found when I was getting ready to move here 5 years ago from Chicago, and frankly didn't know a lot about what to expect when coming to Leeds. I was coming here for a bit out of the blue, and I started searching around for interesting poets and writers and artists from Leeds. And as soon as I found Tony Harris, and in particular V, and saw that video, first that just opened up all sorts of possibilities, and I just in sense of what Leeds was all about. And it still remains to me, I think, one of the most, maybe the most insightful work of art I've seen about Leeds and this place.
And the thing about the poem V is, although it was written in 1984 against a backdrop of unemployment, political strife and a right-wing government, it feels really relevant now. And so when you read it, it hasn't really dated at all. And that perhaps says something about where we've gone wrong as a society, in a way that we haven't moved on from the things that he's depicting in there as things that need to change. But I'd recommend that anybody who can gets a copy of V. I know there's a copy in the library downstairs at Chapel FM here in Seacroft. Gets a copy of V, reads it, and actually visits Beeston Cemetery. And you can see, because it's set about the fact that it was inspired by the fact that Tony had visited his father and mother's gravestone in Beeston Cemetery overlooking Ellen Road, and it had been graffitied on by a Leeds United supporter. And so it led Tony to think, why did this Leeds United supporter do that? What are they trying to say? What is this all about? The similarities and differences between my life as a poet and the life of that Leeds United supporter that's scrawling words on gravestones. And so I'd recommend that people look at that. And the poetry that Tony wrote about his family, about growing up as a working class lad in Beeston, about his dad, about his mum, about the loss of them both, that series of poetry that he wrote, that series of poems he wrote about that, are really worth exploring. Because as you say, you find out about Leeds when Tony was growing up, and right through to the kind of 80s or 90s when he stopped writing that series. It talks about the Queen's Hotel. It talks about the bus from Beeston into Leeds City Centre. It talks, for example, and when I have spoken with Tony, he's told me about this, the poetry he wrote about the Second World War, about the bombing of Dresden, the poetry he wrote in Prometheus, which relates to the Holocaust, that came from the spring of seeing in the cinema in Leeds City Centre the old newsreels, because at the time when he was growing up there was news at the cinema, and he saw reports of the Holocaust. He saw reports of the bombing of Dresden, other news stories, and they made a massive impression on him as a child, seeing those things on the cinema screen. And these things being burnt into his memory, and that affected his poetry growing up. So seeing the news reports at cinemas in Leeds, growing up to write poetry about these historical events. So everything comes back to Leeds in a way with Tony. I think his poetry shows that.
And this film, we'll turn to the film we're going to be screening here today, Black Daisies for the Bride. It's actually filmed not too far from Leeds, just outside of Ilkley and Menston. And so the theme of this year's festival is missing. And so as soon as that theme was announced, we had the connection of doing, last year we screened Prometheus. This film immediately sprang to mind for a number of reasons, but among others, it deals with Alzheimer's, dementia, loss of memory, but also just the history of Leeds and Yorkshire and spaces. And it's a film that was originally broadcast in 1994, filmed the year before. So in the middle of his film poetry, I'm going to read a little bit in just a moment about some of his words about it. And it's a fascinating film also in the sense of how it again fulfills this idea of film poetry, a poet's use of the medium of film. Among other things, it mixes some scripted, some very much poetic scripted language, and some very much actuality documentary footage in ways that's quite unusual to sort of weave those two things together in moments that I think will sometimes be clear which is which and other times a bit not so. But also just the use of imagery and the way of structuring a film, the rhythm of a film, moving between images, sound, objects, visual metaphors, the way that a poet might use language metaphorically. You'll see images throughout the film that are quite metaphorical. To me, it almost opens up a whole alternative universe of what cinema could look like in the hands of poets. There's also I want to just call attention to the director who worked with Tony Harrison, who's a fascinating person who I've been reading a lot about the last couple of days, which is Peter Sims. And I don't know if Richard, if you come across him at all, if Tony's mentioned his role in the work at all.
Yeah, so he's somebody that Tony's always spoken of very highly, and he did a whole series of film poems with Tony. If I remember correctly, the first film poems he did with Tony were the ones called In Loving Memory.
Yeah, about cemeteries and funeral rituals.
About the way that in different countries and different societies they mark the passing of people, whether it be in Italy or in England or anywhere else. And they had a long working career together. An interesting thing when you watch Tony Harrison's film poems is to know how he made them. So he didn't go into making any film poem with the script or the poem already written. It would be written normally on set, day by day, which is why you end up with the situation where you see images that then the poetry is about. So I think in Black Daisies for the Bride, there's a kind of stone, what would you call it? Not a mural, some kind of stone pattern at the High Roads Hospital of Black Daisies, and that's where the aspect Black Daisies for the Bride comes from. And the same that you see in film poems like Prometheus, there are things that they spot, and in Blasphemer's Banquet and in all the film poems, things that they spot when they're walking around Tony and Peter Symes and Jocelyn Herbert as well, who was a great set designer with him, spotting things that they thought that would make a good shot in the film, and then the poetry would refer to that. And so writing under pressure, writing new parts of the film poem every day as they see different things and film different things, makes it for a really organic, energetic, poetic experience.
And here's a little bit of what Peter Symes writes about just that process of working with Tony Harrison, just to hear a bit of his own language about it. I should also mention that Peter Symes was a key person in setting up the Sheffield Documentary Film Festival in the early '90s, which is still running and is, by all accounts, one of, if not the strongest documentary film festival in the country as well. So there's an important legacy that he has there as well. I'm just going to read just a brief passage here. So he writes, the intense research followed by a documentary filming period of 2 weeks, during which time the world of Winside Ward at High Roads Hospital, Menston, West Yorkshire, was recorded, was followed by an initial post-production period for documentary editing and writing. And the drama shoot was next and took place over 8 days. And I have in my files an extensive list of documentary material that was decided was required. And then we turned to the cutting rooms to edit and to write commentary, which was also sung. And Tony, now having decided he could do this using the metrical vehicle of In the Bleak Midwinter, this time something very different was being attempted. From the first time, we were going to interweave performance with documentary, and we were going to do it in an ethically difficult arena. Yet it seemed the only way to offer an insight into the world of the sufferers, placing them center stage without the intervention of professionals in white coats, while at the same time allowing us to give the viewer a hint of their past lives. And he writes, "It's not for nothing that Harrison has chosen to call his works film poems, and his willingness to work in this way may seem to many writers to be brave, but to me seems quite natural. He's embraced every new idea and piece of technology, but harnessed it to the oldest art. The classical education, the extraordinary breadth of reference, directness, mordant wit, all these and more have gone into the alchemical mix, which has given us this film poet of outstanding versatility and power. It's all poetry to me," he writes there. So, well, in just a bit, Elliot, how are we doing on time for getting ready for the film screening? Okay. And by the way, we've got a few people here in the audience as well. If anybody does have questions about Tony Harrison and his work and so forth, we do welcome any questions as well. But Richard, so among the other films that Tony has done, we'll just describe a couple of the others just to give a better sense of the range of things. So The Blasphemer's Banquet is a film about the Salman Rushdie affair and the burning of books and free speech. He has a film about Hiroshima, The Shadow of Hiroshima. We've talked about Prometheus, and then the films about funerals, Crossings, about migrants. So all topics, and I think any one of them would be great to bring back and continue to share. Other thoughts on Tony's relevance to you, how his work has shaped your work?
Well, I think that his anti-war poetry is so powerful, and the fact that he published that poetry in newspapers as part of the news, so part of the kind of daily culture of our lives, was something that was quite profound, I thought, because all the way through his work, he's found different ways to use poetry, whether it be as a film, whether it be in a newspaper as almost like news reportage, or whether it be in a book or a reading, or on the stage. And I think that's what makes him unique as a poet, and he's found different mediums for his poetry. But I'm really glad that we're here today to watch this film, a film poem which is very powerful, which is hard to watch, but has an important message. And I'd encourage everybody to explore Tony's work. I think V is probably a good place for people to start, particularly people from Leeds, and then they can maybe move on to whatever takes a fancy, because he's written so much. But I think people also from Leeds particularly would enjoy the poetry about growing up, the poetry about his relationship with his parents, the poetry about being a working class young person from Leeds, getting a scholarship and ending up in the poetic and theatre circles. I think people find it very, very interesting indeed, and let's embrace that as people from Leeds.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for joining us for the introduction here to Black Daisies for the Bride, and I think it's just about time to begin the screening, so we'll take it away. And here we are on East Leeds Community Radio, Writing on Air Festival, Black Daisies for the Bride.